As it became clear how massive the mail-in ballot returns would be for the November 3rd election, I believe the number reached was about 100 million by November 2nd. I began to see people on social media express concerns about potentially fraudulent voting that could be taking place due to the massive amounts of mail-in votes. Now, election fraud is a big subject, and I plan to discuss various aspects of it in different videos. But today, I'd like to discuss election fraud by the voter for the purpose of casting votes improperly. What forms can it take? Which of these forms are feasible for successfully fraudulently voting? And are any of these methods scalable to the numbers needed to sway an election by a nefarious organization or entity like a political party? Welcome to 10 Minutes for Democracy. Did you vote by mail for the first time this past election day? Leave a comment and let me know. November 3rd was actually just my second time voting by mail. The California primary was the first time. When the pandemic hit, I had them send me my ballot. Anyways, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. As I mentioned in the teaser, the term election fraud can mean different things to different people. There are many aspects to how elections are run, and all are potentially susceptible to fraud or malfeasance. Today, we're talking about what I will call voter fraud. Fraud by the voter in the process of voting, specifically to cast a vote they should not be casting. There are several ways one might try to do this, based on generally how American elections are run. When a county mails real ballots to its citizens, there are several ways those citizens might try to improperly cast a vote. If a ballot is mailed to a dead person, which does happen, the person that receives it in the mail can try to vote fraudulently by filling it out, signing it, and mailing it in. If a ballot is mailed to the wrong address, which also happens, the person that receives it in the mail can try to vote fraudulently by filling it out, signing it, and mailing it in. If a person receives their ballot in the mail and wants to vote twice fraudulently, they can fill it out, sign it, and mail it in, and then on election day, try to vote in person as well. As for in-person voting without any mail-in ballot component, the common voting fraud scenario is of a person going to a polling place, pretending that they're somebody else by giving that person's name, signing as that person, and then voting on that person's behalf, in addition to voting as themselves in the same election. This scenario is ostensibly the reason for requiring voter ID to vote. The next question is, are these forms of voter fraud feasible? Let's handle the in-person situation first, as it also includes an explanation of provisional ballots, which are important for several of these scenarios. So what if in a state or locality that doesn't require voter ID for voting, a person tries to pretend to be somebody they are not to vote on their behalf? Well, first, that person would obviously have to go to a different polling place than the one they voted in as him or herself. In denser populated areas, that's easy, but for voting fraudsters in rural areas, they may have to travel pretty far just to find an alternative voting place. Also, unless they know which polling place the person they are pretending to vote for is supposed to go to, they would likely have to vote with a provisional ballot unless they guess correctly. Now, when a voter is registered to vote in person, they are told which polling station to go to. If they go there, their name is on a list and they sign by it to get their ballot. If they go anywhere else, their name won't be on the list, so they will be given what is called a provisional ballot to vote with. That ballot is treated with extra scrutiny and validation because it is out of the ordinary voting process. Something's gone wrong. In the past, I have heard reports of counties not even bothering to vote provisional ballots, unless there was a close race. I hope that isn't still happening. Every legally cast ballot should be tallied. Anyway, if the person whose name is being used fraudulently is actually voting by mail, any in-person voting on their behalf would trigger a provisional ballot and be subject to that extra level of scrutiny because their name wouldn't be on any list. Now lastly, especially in the case of provisional ballots, the fraudster would need to know the real person's signature as it's likely to be checked when the ballot is eventually processed, assuming it is. So successfully voting while pretending to be another person is actually a lot more difficult and more impractical than it would at first seem. Now, as for mail-in ballot voter fraud, if one receives somebody else's mail-in ballot in error, whether they are deceased or not, it isn't very difficult to fill it out and send it in if you know their signature. However, If that ballot was just sent to you in error and the person is still alive, and you know them well enough to know their signature, why would you fraudulently vote on their behalf? And regardless of that, how do you know they won't try to vote in person since they didn't get their actual mail-in ballot? They probably will, which will trigger a provisional ballot that would then be in conflict with the ballot you mailed in. And they could request another mail-in ballot, which would invalidate the first. But what about trying to vote by mail with your own ballot and then voting in person? It probably won't work. The reason why? The provisional ballot process. If you go to vote on election day after being sent a mail-in ballot, your name won't be on the list of voters at any polling station. You'll have to fill out a provisional ballot. And as I explained earlier, those are subject to more scrutiny. Most of the methods one might try in order to cast an extra vote are not feasible even on a small scale. But yes, you can vote for a dead friend or relative if their mail-in ballot is sent to you and you can recreate their signature. But you also need to ask yourself, who is really willing to intentionally risk committing multiple felonies to vote one extra time? When we talk about illegitimate results and tainted elections, we are talking about fraud at the scale that can be expected by people committing these acts to turn elections. That's generally thousands of votes at the minimum. You can't commit one act of voter fraud and rationally think you are at all likely to be changing the outcome of an election unless you know of or even coordinating with thousands of other people doing the same thing with the same intended outcome. So, can a group like a political party scale these individual voter frauds up to a level that could turn an actual election to a degree of certainty to be worth risking federal jail time? As I said, the only feasible voter fraud that is likely to amount to extra votes is voting on behalf of a dead person. But it doesn't seem to me that voting for a dead person is scalable. You'd have to have access to a county voting system such that you could reroute the ballots of thousands of dead people to an alternative address or addresses to be illegally manipulated. But how would you know who was dead? The county election system wouldn't tell you, because if it knew, the dead would be removed from the voter rolls. You'd have to have some other way of finding thousands of dead voters within a single county for a single election and have access to that county's election system to manipulate ballot mailing. Does that sound reasonable to you? Sometimes policies like requiring voter ID and restricting mail-in ballots are described as cost-benefit trade-offs between election fidelity and easier voter access. But that isn't what it looks like to me, because there's no evidence of anything more than extremely minuscule amounts of what we might call voter fraud. And the reason for that, despite the theoretical possibility, is it is extremely impractical, as voting systems are designed to catch errors and duplicate ballots. Being in favor of these so-called election protections, you'd have to be willing to potentially disenfranchise millions of Americans solely to prevent a theoretical possibility. Take mail-in balloting. Mail-in balloting is generally permitted for the elderly, if anybody, even though they are by far the most likely voter to pass away, leaving a potential dead person ballot, the cause of the only feasible type of voter fraud by mail. If anything, the elderly should be the last people we consider mailing ballots to in the context of election security. But to prevent the theoretical chance of a dead person's ballot being submitted improperly, are we willing to disenfranchise millions of elderly voters who are physically unable to vote otherwise? I believe most people are going to say no. Requiring voter ID to vote is actually not that different of an issue. One of the classes of voters most likely affected by requiring ID to vote is the elderly. They often don't drive anymore and generally have no need for ID. Why make it harder for them and other people without IDs to vote because of the possible but wholly impractical chance of a person going into a polling station to cast a provisional ballot while pretending to be another person? Yes, people make mistakes, vote when they shouldn't, accidentally vote twice, even maybe vote for a dead relative while still grieving because they feel like they knew their wishes. But what you have to ask yourself is, how many millions of voters are you willing to disenfranchise for the mistakes of a statistically imperceptible number of people? If you liked the video, hit the like button. Please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Click on the slide below to continue watching 10 Minutes for Democracy. Thank you.